For 30 years, the world broke. Not a sudden, sharp snap, but a slow, agonizing fracture that consumed an entire civilization. In the 17th century, Central Europe was the hinge of the continent. It was where the new world of Protestantism collided with the old world of Catholic Empire. And when that collision happened, the hinge snapped. It began with a squabble over religion. It escalated into a continent-spanning clash of kings and empires, and it would kill millions, wiping out up to 1/3 of the German population. Cities were reduced to ash, armies lived by plunder, and the world's map was permanently redrawn. This is the story of that conflict, a war so devastating, so complex, that it had to invent a new way for nations to exist. This is the story of how the 30 Years' War destroyed the past and created the modern world. In the year 1618, Central Europe was a tinderbox, a sprawling, fractured political entity known as the Holy Roman Empire. It was not holy nor Roman, and arguably not an empire. It was instead a fragile, decades-long peace, maintained by exhaustion and grudging compromise. When the violence finally erupted, it would not be a swift regional conflict, but a catastrophic, grinding war that consumed an entire generation, killed up to 1/3 of the German population, and fundamentally reshaped the continent. It began as a religious quarrel and ended as a pure geopolitical power struggle. This is the story of the 30 Years' War. To understand the spark of 1618, we must first look back over 60 years to the Peace of Augsburg of 1555. This agreement was intended to end the fighting between Catholic and Lutheran princes following the Protestant Reformation. Its core principle was simple yet flawed: cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion. This meant that a local prince could choose either Catholicism or Lutheranism, and his subjects were bound to follow suit. The land determined the faith. For a time, this held the lid on the boiling pot. But the peace was inherently unstable for three critical reasons. Firstly, it established a permanent fault line across the empire, where neighbors could, by decree, be religious adversaries. Secondly, the agreement contained a clause known as the Reservatum Ecclesiasticum, which stated that any Catholic bishop who converted to Protestantism must resign his office and forfeit his lands. This was a constant point of friction, as Protestant princes often ignored it. And thirdly, and most fatally, the Peace of Augsburg completely excluded Calvinism. The strict, rapidly spreading Reformed faith was a major political and theological power, particularly in regions like the Palatinate and Bohemia. The Calvinists were neither recognized nor protected under the peace. They were, in the eyes of imperial law, still heretics. The political reality was a chaotic web of power. At the top sat the Holy Roman Emperor, drawn from the powerful, devoutly Catholic Habsburg dynasty. He was meant to rule over hundreds of semi-autonomous territories, but his authority was limited. Beneath him were the electors, 7 high-ranking princes, 3 clerical, 4 secular, who held the right to choose the emperor. These men, along with the thousands of nobles, bishops, and free cities, fiercely guarded their independence, known as Germanic liberties. By the early 17th century, the political divide was rigid. The Catholic princes had formed the Catholic League, a powerful defensive and offensive alliance led by Duke Maximilian of Bavaria. Their Protestant rivals, in turn, formed the Protestant Union, led by the staunch Calvinist Frederick V, Elector Palatine. The stage was now set. 2 powerful, armed, and religiously defined blocs facing one another in a political system that was structurally incapable of settling disputes peacefully. All that was needed was a slight misstep, a simple act of profound arrogance to send the entire system tumbling down. Our focus narrows now to the Kingdom of Bohemia, an electorate and a Habsburg possession with a long history of anti-Catholic sentiment, tracing back to the Hussite Wars of the 15th century. Here, the Protestant majority had managed to secure a degree of religious freedom under a document called the Letter of Majesty in 1609. However, the incoming Holy Roman Emperor, Ferdinand II, was a zealous, uncompromising Catholic, educated by Jesuits, and absolutely committed to stamping out Protestantism in his own domains. He had no intention of respecting the Bohemian liberties. As soon as he was named King of Bohemia in 1617, Ferdinand began systematically undermining the Letter of Majesty. He dissolved Protestant assemblies, restricted the construction of new Protestant churches, and appointed staunchly Catholic officials to govern in his stead while he was away. The Bohemian estates, the Protestant noble class, watched these actions with rising alarm. They saw a systematic assault on their rights, their liberties, and their faith. They had granted sovereignty to a man whose express goal was to strip them of everything they held dear. The moment of crisis arrived on May 23rd, 1618. A delegation of furious Protestant nobles marched to Hradčany Castle in Prague, the seat of Bohemian government, demanding an audience with the emperor's regents Jaroslav Borita of Martinice and Willem Slavata of Chlum. The meeting quickly devolved into a shouting match. The nobles accused the regents of violating the fundamental laws of the land. The regents, protected by imperial authority, dismissed their complaints, arguing that the emperor's will was paramount. Seeing no justice and fearing complete subjugation, the nobles turned to a time-honored Bohemian tradition of political protest, defenestration. They seized the two Catholic regents along with their secretary, Philip Fabricius, dragged them to a high window overlooking the castle moat, and physically threw them out. They fell approximately 70 feet. Miraculously, they survived the fall. Some accounts credit a large pile of soft refuse or manure beneath the window. The Catholic side declared the men were saved by the intervention of the Virgin Mary. The Protestants simply claimed they landed in dung. The fact of their survival was immaterial. The act itself was a violent, public, and absolute rejection of Habsburg rule. The Bohemian nobles had committed treason. They had thrown the dice. The Holy Roman Emperor, Ferdinand II, now had no choice but to respond with force. The Protestant Union had no choice but to mobilize. The defenestration of Prague was not the war itself, but the undeniable, irreversible declaration that peace was over. The fuse was lit. The defenestration of Prague was an act of open rebellion, and the response from the House of Habsburg was swift and uncompromising. The rebellious Bohemian nobles, led by their new, hastily crowned King Frederick V, the Elector Palatine, who was also the head of the Protestant Union, had fatally miscalculated. Frederick, nicknamed the Winter King for his brief, single winter of rule, expected immediate and massive support from the Protestant princes of the empire. It never materialized. Many Protestant rulers, fearful of the emperor's power, chose to remain neutral or offer only token assistance. Emperor Ferdinand II, meanwhile, mobilized the Catholic League army under the command of the brilliant Count Tilly, a veteran soldier and devout Catholic. The climax of this first phase came in 1620 at the Battle of White Mountain, just outside Prague. It was a quick and devastating blow. In less than 2 hours, Tilly's forces shattered the combined Bohemian and Palatinate armies. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Frederick V and his family fled into exile. The Bohemian revolt was crushed. 27 leaders of the revolt were publicly executed in Prague's Old Town Square. The Protestant faith, which had flourished in Bohemia for centuries, was ruthlessly suppressed. Lands and titles were confiscated from the Protestant nobility and given to loyal Catholic foreigners. Bohemia became, for all intents and purposes, a Habsburg domain for the next 300 years, firmly and permanently re-Catholicized. The war should have ended here. The emperor had won a crushing victory and re-established his absolute authority. But by punishing Frederick VI and seizing his territory, Ferdinand had directly attacked a major Protestant electorate, guaranteeing that the war would now spread far beyond the borders of Bohemia. With the Protestant Union shattered, the religious and political freedom of all German princes seemed to hang by a thread. This existential threat prompted the first foreign power to intervene directly, Denmark. In 1625, King Christian IV of Denmark, a Lutheran and Duke of Holstein within the Holy Roman Empire, entered the fray. Christian saw himself as the champion of the Protestant cause, and perhaps more significantly, he saw an opportunity to gain territory and influence in northern Germany. However, the Emperor Ferdinand II had learned a critical lesson. Relying on the Catholic League's army alone gave too much power to his allies, particularly Duke Maximilian of Bavaria. To counterbalance this, Ferdinand authorized the creation of a vast new imperial army, a force funded not by state treasuries, but by private enterprise. This is where the second, and arguably more destructive, star of the Catholic side enters the narrative. Albrecht von Wallenstein, a Bohemian nobleman who had grown fabulously wealthy from the confiscated estates after the Battle of White Mountain. Wallenstein was a military entrepreneur and a man of immense ambition. He offered the emperor a deal. He would raise, equip, and command a massive army of professional mercenaries, up to 50,000 men, on the condition that the army would be self-financing. Wallenstein's troops would be paid, fed, and supplied not by the emperor, but by extorting contributions from the lands they occupied, regardless of whether that land belonged to a friend or an enemy. This system of organized plunder fundamentally changed the nature of the war, exponentially increasing the burden and misery inflicted upon the civilian population. War became a self-sustaining machine of destruction. Wallenstein's army, a sprawling, multinational force of professional fighters, was wildly successful. He, along with Count Tilly, systematically defeated the Danish and Protestant armies. Christian IV of Denmark was a competent ruler, but no match for the combined imperial forces. Wallenstein's armies pushed north, defeating the Danes repeatedly, seizing territories and eventually occupying much of the northern German coast, including the Baltic duchies. By 1629, Christian IV was forced to sign the Treaty of Lübeck, withdrawing from the war entirely and promising never again to intervene in imperial affairs. The Protestant champions were defeated, Denmark was neutralized, and the Catholic, imperial power of the Habsburgs was at its zenith. The Emperor Ferdinand now believed he had won the war entirely, but in his moment of greatest power, he made the second fatal error that ensured the war would continue for another 2 decades. Flush with victory and emboldened by Wallenstein's invincible army, Ferdinand issued the Edict of Restitution in 1629. This was not a move to bring peace. It was a move to complete the Catholic victory. The edict demanded that all church lands seized by Protestant rulers since the Peace of Augsburg 1555, must be immediately returned to the Catholic Church. This encompassed thousands of monasteries, bishoprics, and church foundations across the empire, many of which had been Protestant property for over 70 years. The edict was a catastrophic piece of legislation. Firstly, it infuriated the Protestants, proving that the emperor intended nothing less than the total reversal of the Reformation. It gave them a fresh, undeniable reason to continue the fight, as their territory and power were under direct threat. Secondly, and crucially, it alarmed the emperor's Catholic allies. The implementation of the edict relied on Wallenstein's army, which ignored the rights of all princes, Catholic and Protestant alike, to seize and transfer property. Powerful Catholic rulers, especially Duke Maximilian of Bavaria, worried that a victorious, all-powerful Emperor Ferdinand, backed by a rogue general like Wallenstein, would destroy the ancient Germanic liberties that protected all princes from imperial centralization. Catholic and Protestant leaders briefly united in their fear of a new, absolute Habsburg monarchy. This fear of Wallenstein, the emperor's most successful weapon, was cleverly exploited by Ferdinand's enemies, particularly the French, who sought to maintain the German fragmentation. At the Regensburg Diet in 1630, Catholic princes insisted that the emperor must choose: either he dismiss Wallenstein and his enormous, rampaging mercenary army, or risk turning the Catholic League against him. Ferdinand, despite his reluctance to remove the man who had delivered him victory, needed the support of the Catholic electors to secure the election of his son as the next emperor. He bowed to the pressure. Wallenstein was summarily dismissed and retired to his estates. The great imperial army was significantly reduced, its troops dispersed across various garrisons. The emperor had centralized too much power, frightened his own allies, and in doing so, removed the only tool capable of defending his conquests. The Catholic Habsburgs were at their military peak, but politically isolated. Europe held its breath, waiting for the inevitable counterpunch. That counterpunch was already landing on the shores of the Baltic. In July 1630, shortly before Wallenstein's dismissal, a new, far more formidable foreign power had landed in Pomerania, in northern Germany, Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden. The Lion of the North was not just another religious interventionist. He was perhaps the greatest military innovator of the age, and his arrival would not only save the Protestant cause, but completely change the character of warfare in Europe. His intervention was backed by a bizarre paradox. The primary financier of this staunch Lutheran champion was none other than the ultra-Catholic Cardinal Richelieu of France, who was more concerned with destroying Habsburg power than defending the Catholic faith. The war was about to enter its most dramatic and bloody phase. The arrival of Gustavus Adolphus in 1630 was, for the beleaguered Protestants of Germany, nothing short of miraculous. For the Holy Roman Empire, it was a profound and devastating shock. Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden, was a highly intelligent, intensely devout Lutheran and a charismatic military genius. He intervened for a mix of reasons: to protect the Protestant faith, to seize territory in northern Germany for the expansion of the Swedish Empire, specifically control of the Baltic Sea trade, known as Dominium Maris Baltici, and crucially, to exploit the moment of weakness created by Ferdinand II's dismissal of Wallenstein. His intervention was made possible by the political maneuvering of the great French statesman Cardinal Richelieu. Though Catholic, Richelieu's true religion was the glory of France. He signed the Treaty of Bowalder with Sweden, agreeing to pay a massive annual subsidy to Gustavus Adolphus. ensuring that the war against the Habsburgs would continue, keeping Germany fractured and weak. Gustavus Adolphus was not just a soldier, he was a reformer. He arrived in Germany with a highly disciplined, motivated, and professionally trained army, often called the Blue and Yellow Brigades. Gustavus Adolphus's military reforms were revolutionary and gave his troops a decisive advantage over the traditional imperial armies led by Count Tilly. His genius lay in increasing flexibility and firepower. 1. The musket revolution. He lightened the standard musket, reducing the need for the heavy, awkward rest, and introduced cartridges to speed up reloading. Crucially, he perfected the tactic of countermarching, where ranks would fire in sequence and immediately file to the back to reload, ensuring a continuous hail of bullets. 2. The light artillery. Imperial artillery was heavy and slow. Gustavus developed a lighter, more mobile leather cannon that could be easily moved on the battlefield, providing infantry with immediate, flexible fire support. 3. Mixed formation. He abandoned the large, slow, Spanish-style tercios, huge squares of pike and shot, in favor of smaller, more mobile brigade formations. He masterfully integrated pikemen for defense against cavalry, musketeers for offense, and cavalry, used in an aggressive shock charge role, firing only at close range. These tactical innovations meant that when the Swedish army finally met the imperial forces on the open field, they were faster, more flexible, and packed a superior, more sustained punch. Before Gustavus Adolphus could fully engage the emperor's main forces, he needed to secure his flanks and link up with German Protestant princes who were still wavering. But the city of Magdeburg, a strong Protestant bastion, held out against a prolonged siege by the imperial forces under Count Tilly. Gustavus was attempting to organize a relief force, but the Protestant electors of Saxony and Brandenburg, perpetually fearful and hesitant, refused to grant him passage through their territory. They delayed him just long enough. In May 1631, Count Tilly's forces finally breached the city walls. What followed was one of the most infamous atrocities of the war. Imperial troops, frustrated by the long siege and inflamed by religious hatred, lost all discipline. The city was systematically plundered, raped, and then set ablaze. The fire, whether started accidentally by the soldiers or deliberately by retreating defenders, became an inferno. An estimated 20,000 of Magdeburg's 25,000 citizens were massacred or burned alive. The smoke from the city was visible for miles, and the devastation was so complete that the term Magdeburgisation became a European synonym for absolute destruction. The atrocity served two key purposes. It became a powerful piece of Protestant propaganda, showcasing the cruelty of the emperor's forces, and it shamed the hesitant Protestant princes into action. The electors of Saxony and Brandenburg realized they had no choice. They had to ally with Gustavus Adolphus or face the fate of Magdeburg. The alliance of Swedish and Saxon forces finally marched south, leading to the first great test between the new Swedish military model and the old imperial style. The Battle of Breitenfeld near Leipzig in September 1631 was arguably the single most important military engagement of the 30 Years' War. Initially, the imperial army under Tilly, employing their massive, slow-moving tercios, shattered the Saxon wing of the Allied army, which fled the field. It looked like another Catholic victory, but Gustavus Adolphus quickly wheeled his entire Swedish force to cover the gap. In the ensuing clash, the Swedish superiority in flexible formations, mobile artillery, and rapid continuous musket fire proved overwhelming. The imperial troops, unable to reposition quickly enough, were methodically destroyed. Count Tilly himself was severely wounded. The imperial army, which had not suffered a major field defeat in over a decade, was routed. Strategically, it shattered the illusion of Habsburg invincibility and forced Emperor Ferdinand to confront the reality that he was losing the war. Territorially, it opened up southern Germany, allowing Gustavus Adolphus to launch a massive, deep invasion, wintering in Mainz, and essentially turning the war from a struggle for Habsburg authority into a general European conflict fought on German soil. In response to the catastrophic defeat at Breitenfeld, Ferdinand II realized his mistake in dismissing his one truly capable commander. Desperate, he begged Albrecht von Wallenstein to return to imperial command. Wallenstein, the great military entrepreneur, agreed, but only on terms that made him virtually a supreme, independent commander, answerable only to himself, with the power to appoint and dismiss his own officers. Ferdinand, having no choice, accepted. Wallenstein quickly raised a massive new imperial army, and for a year, the two great generals, Gustavus Adolphus and Wallenstein, engaged in a cat-and-mouse game of maneuvers and counter-maneuvers across southern and central Germany. The climax of their rivalry came in November 1632 at the Battle of Lützen. The battle was fought in a thick fog, adding to the chaos. It was a vicious back-and-forth struggle. In the decisive moment of the battle, leading a cavalry charge to rally his troops, Gustavus Adolphus was killed. He was shot multiple times and fell from his horse, his body later stripped and recovered. Despite the profound shock and loss of their king, the Swedish forces, now fighting for vengeance and glory, managed to push through and defeat Wallenstein's army, forcing a retreat. Lützen was a Pyrrhic victory for the Swedes. They won the battle, but they lost their king and their true guiding genius. The Protestant cause was saved, but its brilliant leader was gone. With Gustavus Adolphus dead, the Swedish forces fell under the political guidance of Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna, who maintained the war effort. Wallenstein, meanwhile, began to operate with increasing independence. Wallenstein was now at the height of his power, controlling a massive army and effectively acting as a head of state. Yet he became a profoundly mysterious figure. He spent the better part of 1633 engaged in enigmatic peace negotiations, sometimes with the Protestant princes, sometimes with the Swedes, and sometimes even with the French. His true motivations were unclear. Was he trying to impose a genuine peace on the war-weary empire? Or was he secretly maneuvering to seize the crown of Bohemia for himself? Emperor Ferdinand II, always suspicious of Wallenstein's vast ambition, came to believe the worst. The Catholic electors, still terrified of Wallenstein's unaccountable power, pressured the emperor relentlessly. In January 1634, Ferdinand signed a secret order declaring Wallenstein an outlaw and relieving him of command, commanding that he be captured, dead or alive. Wallenstein, realizing his fate was sealed, fled with a small, loyal contingent to Eger in Bohemia, hoping to link up with the Swedes. It was too late. On the night of February 25, 1634, a small group of Irish and Scottish officers, loyal to the emperor and eager for the reward, murdered Wallenstein's remaining officers. They then broke into the Generalissimo's quarters. One officer, an Irishman named Walter Devereux, plunged a partisan into the unarmed Wallenstein's chest as he stood by his bed. The great general, the richest and most feared man in the empire, was dead. The war was now purged of its two most titanic figures, but it was far from over. The conflict was no longer about Catholicism versus Lutheranism. It was now a war for European domination. The end of the religious war ushered in the true age of geopolitical horror. With Wallenstein dead, the emperor's forces, now led by his son, Ferdinand III, secured a major victory over the Swedes and their German allies at the Battle of Nördlingen in 1634. This victory restored much of the imperial confidence and seemed to signal a return to the status quo. This Habsburg resurgence was immediately followed by a temporary peace agreement among the German states, the Peace of Prague in 1635. Many of the Protestant princes, exhausted by war and having seen their Swedish lifeline severed, agreed to a compromise that effectively annulled the destructive Edict of Restitution. It looked, briefly, like a German-only peace, but this peace was precisely what Cardinal Richelieu of France could not tolerate. A stable, unified, victorious Holy Roman Empire under Habsburg control was an existential threat to France. Richelieu had been financing the war. Now, he would join it directly. France formally declared war on the Spanish Habsburgs in 1635, triggering the final, longest, and most purely political phase of the conflict. The war had officially ceased being primarily German or religious. It was now a Bourbon versus Habsburg struggle, fought almost entirely on German soil. The war had lasted 17 years already. It would now last 13 more. With France's direct entry into the conflict in 1635, the 30 Years' War ceased to be primarily a German or religious struggle. It became a titanic pan-European power struggle, often called the Franco-Habsburg War, that would rage for another 13 agonizing years. Cardinal Richelieu, the architect of French foreign policy, was unequivocal. The Habsburgs, who controlled both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, encircled France and posed an existential threat. For France, a fragmented Germany was a strategic imperative. Religion was secondary. Raison d'etat, reason of state, was paramount. The war now widened considerably. French armies, often allied with the Swedes and various German Protestant princes, pushed into the Spanish Netherlands, Italy, and, most crucially, deeper into the already ravaged Holy Roman Empire. The Spanish Habsburgs, in turn, attacked France, threatening Paris itself. This final phase was characterized by a grinding, exhausting war of attrition. There were no more meteoric rises or dramatic shifts like Gustavus Adolphus's campaigns. Instead, it was a slow, methodical devastation, marked by sieges, raids, and an almost complete breakdown of civil order. By this point, the suffering of the civilian population of the Holy Roman Empire was almost unimaginable. For 3 decades, armies, imperial, Swedish, French, Spanish, Danish, had marched and countermarched across the land, and wherever they went, they brought ruin. The system of contributions established by Wallenstein in the Danish phase had become the norm for all armies. Soldiers lived off the land, seizing food, livestock, and resources from villages and towns, whether they were friendly or enemy territory. This led to widespread famine. Crops were trampled, fields lay fallow, and desperate peasants often resorted to cannibalism to survive. Adding to the horror, the war acted as a massive vector for disease. Armies, marching with large concentrations of men, often carried devastating plagues like typhus, dysentery, and bubonic plague. These diseases ravaged both soldiers and civilians, often proving more deadly than battle itself. When an army moved through a region, it would leave a trail of sick and dying in its wake. Estimates vary, but historians generally agree that the population of the Holy Roman Empire declined by between 15% and 30% over the course of the war. Some regions, particularly in the southwest and central parts of Germany, saw their populations fall by as much as 50% to 70%. Entire villages were wiped off the map. Cities were depopulated, their economies shattered for decades, sometimes centuries. The war also saw a dramatic increase in witch hunts, as desperate communities sought scapegoats for the inexplicable suffering around them. Lawlessness was rampant, with roving bands of demobilized soldiers, bandits, and starving peasants adding to the chaos. A generation of Germans was scarred, many living their entire lives without knowing true peace. Despite the relentless fighting, all parties were eventually exhausted. The sheer financial and human cost had become unsustainable. Secret negotiations began in 1641, and by 1643, formal peace conferences were established in two Westphalian cities, Münster for the imperial Catholic powers and France, and Osnabrück for the imperial Protestant powers and Sweden. These were not simple negotiations. They involved over 100 delegations and required immense logistical planning, diplomatic maneuvering, and hundreds of separate agreements. The sheer complexity reflected the fragmented nature of the Holy Roman Empire itself, with every prince, elector, and free city demanding a voice. The peace talks dragged on for 5 years, even as the fighting continued. Victories and defeats on the battlefield often swayed the diplomatic positions at the negotiating tables. Eventually, sheer exhaustion and the desire for stability trumped further conflict. On October 24, 1648, after 30 long years of war, the treaties were finally signed, collectively known as the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia was not just a collection of peace treaties. It was a foundational moment in international relations, establishing a new order that would endure for centuries. Here are its key provisions and lasting impacts. 1. Religious settlement. The principle of cuius regio, ius religio, from the Peace of Augsburg was reaffirmed, but with a crucial update. Calvinism was officially recognized as a legitimate faith within the empire, alongside Catholicism and Lutheranism. This finally resolved the religious aspect of the war. Princes could still determine their state's religion, but subjects were generally granted the right to practice their own faith in private or to emigrate. The date for determining the religious status of secularized church lands was set at 1624, undoing much of the Edict of Restitution. 2. Political reshaping of the Holy Roman Empire. The power of the Holy Roman Emperor was severely curtailed. He could no longer issue laws, declare war, or levy taxes without the consent of the imperial diet, Reichstag. The sovereignty of the individual German states was formally recognized. Each prince gained the right to conduct their own foreign policy, form alliances, and wage war, so long as it wasn't against the emperor or the empire. This cemented the political fragmentation of Germany for over 2 centuries. The United Provinces of the Netherlands, Dutch Republic, and the Swiss Confederation gained formal international recognition as independent states, free from the empire. 3. Territorial changes. France gained territories along its eastern border, solidifying its position as the dominant power in Western Europe. Sweden gained control of key territories in northern Germany, including Western Pomerania, securing its Baltic dominance and making it a major player in imperial politics. Brandenburg Prussia, the future Prussia, gained significant territories, laying the groundwork for its future rise. 4. The birth of the sovereign nation-state. Perhaps the most profound and enduring legacy of Westphalia was the concept of state sovereignty. It established the idea that each state has exclusive sovereignty over its territory, its internal affairs, and its people, free from external interference. This Westphalian system essentially ended the medieval ideal of a unified Christian empire and established the modern international system of independent, coexisting nation-states. The 30 Years' War was a brutal, destructive crucible that forged modern Europe. It cemented religious divisions while simultaneously subordinating religious conflict to the cold calculus of state interest. It broke the power of the Habsburg Empire, accelerated the rise of France, and laid the foundations for the future power of states like Sweden and Brandenburg Prussia. But its true cost was paid by the common people of Germany. The war permanently scarred the demographic, economic, and social fabric of Central Europe. It took generations for some regions to recover their pre-war populations and prosperity. The memory of its horrors profoundly shaped German identity and diplomacy for centuries to come. The 30 Years' War, born of religious zeal, mutated into a dynastic struggle and ended as a total war that redefined the very nature of sovereignty. It stands as a stark testament to the devastating consequences of unchecked religious and political ambition and the profound, transformative power of international conflict. The 30 Years' War was a brutal crucible. It was the last great conflict fought for religion and the first great war fought by the modern state. It left a Central Europe devastated, yet gave birth to the international order we still recognize today. The ashes of destroyed cities like Magdeburg and the millions of lives lost paid the price for a new system, one where kings and princes, rather than popes and emperors, held sovereign power. The Westphalian system was imperfect, but it fundamentally shifted the world, proving that raison d'etat, the national interest, would forever triumph over dynastic ties or religious dogma. If this deep dive into the true horror and revolutionary impact of the war fascinated you, please consider hitting the like button to support the channel. It tells YouTube that history deserves a long and thorough look, and if you want to join us as we explore the stories that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Now, for a bit of historical fun in the comments, the Peace of Westphalia changed everything, but it forced rulers to make incredibly difficult choices. I call this the Westphalian dilemma. Imagine you are one of the powerful Protestant electors after the death of Gustavus Adolphus, and you have two major competing options. The pragmatist choice, the Peace of Prague, 1635. Sign a separate peace with the Emperor Ferdinand II right now. The war ends for you immediately. You give up the fight for territorial gains but secure religious freedom. Calvinism is not officially recognized yet, and, most importantly, you save your people from another decade of Swedish and French armies pillaging your lands. Or the principled choice, continuing to Westphalia, 1648. Stay allied with the Swedes and the French. You risk the total destruction of your state and the death of half your population, but you fight for the complete, permanent victory that leads to the formal recognition of Calvinism and the absolute, legal dismantling of the emperor's power. Which do you choose? Pragmatism or principle? Let me know in the comments below. #pragmatist or #principled, and explain why you'd risk your state's existence for ultimate political victory. Thank you again for watching our very first long-form video here on Echo of the Millennia. We'll see you next time with another chapter from the past.